OVRDARK is a VR sequel to a PS5 flat screen game called Do Not Open, and that game tanked bad. So bad in fact that it hasn't even met the minimum requirements to obtain a Metacritic score, but the original game had one critical flaw that doesn't exist in this sequel. Virtual reality takes horror games to new heights, and this one is no exception, but the question is, are these new heights high enough? Let's find the answer together. A horror game is nothing without a good theme, and it can't just be any creepy 18th century house. It has to be complete with over-the-top decorations and electrical work so bad, you're surprised this place hasn't burned itself down already. In this game, you'll be stepping into the shoes of an investigator named George, and your mission is to find out what happened to your former companion Mike and save his family. A family that for some reason you believe is alive after 5 minutes of scenes like this. Whoa. Oh, that is not good.
No.
Without a doubt, we can agree that common sense doesn't necessarily go hand in hand with horror, and spoiler alert, this game is no exception. Almost the entire time you'll have a functional cell phone, a cell phone you could use to call for backup as you follow the bloodstains throughout this house. But who am I kidding, that'd be too easy. The good news is, throughout this adventure you can expect all your typical horror tropes like flickering lights in dark environments, and doors that close themselves without an immediate explanation. All of this sounds bad with my sarcastic undertones for sure, but at the end of the day, most horror games are like this, and this one doesn't do themes terribly. In fact, it's a bit above average compared to some horror games I've tried. There's actually a lot to be afraid of here, or at least there should be. You forgetting to hit the subscribe button is scary for sure, but what's even scarier is how the graphics are executed here. Now, there are some underwhelming textures here for sure, but the game is so dark that it's hard to notice most of them. As with all VR horror games, the darkness actually works in its favor, hiding some of the less detailed areas and keeping the focus on the more polished elements. Elements like this fire. Fire in this game is the best I've seen in VR, no exaggeration. Except for the heat waves around the fire itself, they're a bit exaggerated, but I don't hate that. I had to double check nearby light sources for comparison, and even the flames on the candles look good. With all the darkness here, your attention is really drawn to the light, and it's great that light sources look good. My only gripe here is that it'd look even better if not for the poor optimization. You will be plagued by this unstoppable stuttering effect in some areas of the house, and I thought it was something on my end, but it turns out it's the game. Even on medium graphical settings, the stuttering persisted, sometimes even letting me see through walls. It's less noticeable in most areas, but overall, noticeable enough to be a serious pain point in this game. You'd think the stuttering could be fixed with some setting tweaks, but speaking of settings. The adjustable settings for graphics are surprisingly fleshed out. They auto-detect based on your equipment, and mine defaulted to Ultra, which I initially thought was the cause for the earlier mentioned flickering and stuttering. I'm not necessarily a fan of the menus themselves, but I like the pre-game bathroom menu you find yourself in. There are definitely less immersive ways to do a pre-game menu. You also have the option to calibrate your hands that for some reason are rotated 90 degrees whenever you launch the game. To calibrate them, you simply go into the settings and hold your hands the right way while holding the trigger. After trying this multiple times, I came to the conclusion that getting this exactly right was impossible, but you can get it to a playable state, which is good enough, I guess. You won't have to worry too much about motion sickness support though, because unfortunately, with no way to fix the stutters, there isn't really a remedy. The game includes settings for turning angles and speeds, which may or may not be useful here, but at least they exist. And since movement in this game is quite slow, you may not even need these settings. What is very unfortunate though is the lack of a seated gameplay option. If anything, with how terrifying horror games can be, these are the kinds of games you expect to have seated gameplay options for. This one is a huge miss, but on the other hand, the audio in this game really surprised me. First, let's talk about the voice acting because it beat my expectations by quite a bit. The characters sound appropriate for the atmosphere and for the most part are pretty believable.
What do you mean?
Something very strange just happened.
Why are you so nervous?
George, aka You, is determined to save Mike's family at all costs. But again, the game gives you too many reasons to believe they are already dead. As a result, your determinations seem a bit out of place, but the audible emotion does a good job picking up the slack. Of course, horror games are nothing without random environmental sound effects, and as you roam the mansion, you'll hear a lot of these.
Oh my god. Michael!
Now, whether they rightly can be called scary is another question. Some sounds feel random and others play every time you walk near a certain spot. Throw in the fact that they're noticeably repetitive and it takes away from the immersion by hurting the suspense. Fortunately, these poorly executed horror game sounds feel like actual horror game sounds, so there's a bit of redemption there, but there is one aspect of every game that can make or break it. Horror games are usually riddled with mechanics that flex brain muscles and test your survival instincts. Usually is the keyword here because these mechanics are definitely lacking. First off, your utility belt doesn't turn when you do unless you're using the joysticks to turn, and I don't know how you feel about this, but it really bothered me. It bothered me about as much as movement, in fact. You may be used to slow movement in horror games, but this one takes it a step beyond that.
How am I out of breath? I ran from there to here.
OVRDARK's definition of sprinting feels at best like a brisk walk, and it doesn't help that 20 feet of brisk walking immediately puts you out of breath. Then there are the puzzles. Interacting with anything feels like a bit of a chore due to how unnatural these interactions feel. This may be due to the noticeable hand miscalibrations mentioned earlier, and this is normally the part where I say something like the good news is, but no. There's none of that when it comes to these mechanics. In fact, it gets even worse. The only thing worse than finding a bug that could potentially block you from progressing in the game is finding two of them. Here's the short version. The first one involves standing still, and there's no consequence if you don't, which I guess is actually a good thing because I literally had to meditate for 30 seconds in reality to get the game to think I was standing still. With that said, I could go on, but this video would be too long and your time is valuable, so let's get closure and see how this title holds up as a VR game in 2024. Theme gets a 4 out of 6. This game may be riddled with generic horror game tropes, but they work, which I guess is the reason why everyone uses them. Throw in a good story and you've got all the makings of a good theme. Graphics gets a 2 out of 6, and it's actually a shame because the graphics in this game aren't actually bad, especially the flames, but the unfixable flickering reduces this score to below average. Options gets a 2 out of 6. While the lobby menu is pretty immersive, it's hard to redeem the hand calibration oversight and the fact that most of these options are only accessible from the pre-game lobby. Audio gets a 4 out of 6. Audio is an area where this game really shines. While there are some noticeable pain points with uninspired environmental sounds, the voice acting complements the audio well. And mechanics gets a 1 out of 6. There's no nice way to put this, there's too many aspects of this game that don't function the way they're supposed to. The mechanics feel like they're barely ready to enter beta testing phase and are the most obvious reason this game isn't faring too well. There is a lot I want out of this horror game, and it being in VR gives it so many chances to succeed. For a horror game in VR, this game is noticeably unpolished though, and has unfortunately earned an immersion score of 2 out of 6. I wouldn't recommend spending your money on this game in its current state, but there are games I definitely would recommend. Check out my other videos and subscribe for your weekly dose of VR game reviews, but until next time, stay immersed.